Egyptian people are very welcoming people. Out of all the Arab, I'll guarantee you they have the best sense of humor. And the
For sure.
Lebanese. But for sure, Egyptians actually have the best sense of humor ever. The Lebanese, they more have this kind of nice gesture, but the Egyptians, they have the nicest sense of humor. Very welcoming too. You will really love
Wait,
them.
I'm trying to figure out who's my friend that from Egypt. I'm trying to figure out. You know,
Yes,
Sister Fatima.
you really got to think of it.
Yeah, I need to learn Arabic seriously. This is my
Inshallah.
one of my
So Bishara,
goals.
our the live actually started. So sorry, Bishara, I would love to hear you. All right, everybody. So assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And everyone, we are back with our tafsir, and let's really get to know, since it wasn't too long ago, it was yesterday, right? It's going to be really easy to remember what we did. وكذلك نفصل الآيات ولتستبين سبيل المجرمين. So that, well, no, we left off at really, where was it? قل إني على بينة من ربي. That's where we left off at because I was afraid to leave at a different spot. Okay, so let's just kind of remember and kind of review what we had done yesterday, right? Let's do it. And we were actually talking about a number of different things yesterday. And number one, وَإِذَا جَاءَكَ الَّذِينَ يُؤْمِنُونَ بِآيَاتِنَا فَقُلْ سَلَامٌ عَلَيْكُمْ. And that's when we actually went in details about grading the believers, about the circle and the orbit of the people that you surround yourself with. And we talked about Salamun alaykum. We also talked about Kataba Rabbukum ala nafsihi ar-rahmah. We also talked about that part about recognizing that the Lord Almighty had ordained upon himself that he would be merciful. And then we also went in details about Isu. We talked a lot about al-jahala, what al-jahala was and how is it different from jahiliyyah. We also talked about jahila and saluha. And I think I forgot to mention, I guess the area that comes within this parameter is the area when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about Prophet Nuh. I think that was in Surah Hud, is it? Yeah, I think it's in Surah Hud. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about how Prophet Nuh alayhi salam was calling out his son. We know that one. Then the waves would come, and Prophet Nuh alayhi salam, eventually says, Inna bini min ahli. That's the key thing that I wanted to focus on. Inna bini min ahli, my son is part of my family. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells him, Innahu laysa min ahlik, and Innahu amalun ghayru salih. He's not part of your family, for the action that he had done is not pious. And then he says, Inni a'idhuka an takuna min al-jahilin. I warned you from becoming amongst al-jahilin. I want you to notice here that you had two key verbs or at least key words within this, which is innahu laysa min ahlik. He's not part of your family. And then innahu amalun ghayru salih. These two keywords, amalun ghayru salih, and that action basically that action is not salih, is not a pious action. And then inni a'idhuka an takuna min al-jahilin. I want you to see that salih, the word salih, and the word jahilin, which basically goes to the root luha and jahila. If you look at these two words, they actually are keywords within this ayah. And the same thing, if you look at this ayah, you could see that contrast coming in the same context and the same idea that if a person would commit a jahiliyyah or a jahil behavior, which basically means a behavior that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not approve of, and then repents to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then what aslaha? Then they would basically get into the perimeter. I want you to look at the word aslaha because the alif basically means to go inside a certain perimeter. So this is telling us that a person committing an action of jahiliyyah is basically putting themselves outside of the perimeter of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay. And then a person that decides to repent, that's the start. Okay. The start to get near the perimeter is a person basically seeking repentance, seeking forgiveness. Then, of course, if they determine to continue in order to be in the perimeter of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that's that alif right there. It's not enough to have the intention to regret what you had done. It's not enough to have the intention to never go back. That's the start. But to really get into the perimeter, you would really have to get into a new action, a new set of behavior. And that is aslaha. You know, just like when you say amsa, you say asbaha, that means entered in al-masa, or entered at nighttime, or entered in morning, etc. So you're looking at that this person is entering a parameter of piety, a parameter where they would recognize that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to be giving them that determination and giving them the support in order to really live that iman and recognize that they are included in the forgiveness and in the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we talked a little bit about this one. وَكَذَلِكَ نُفَصِّلُ الْآيَاتِ وَلِتَسْتَبِينَ سَبِيلُ الْمُجْرِمِينَ. And that's how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala نُفَصِّل. We didn't go into all the details about this one because when you say nufassal al-ayat, okay, so you're looking at giving us that there are certain ayat that basically have certain details, but altogether there are certain details that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had explained in order for us to really have a complete vision. But do we really have a complete vision, or certain things necessarily incomplete, or at least we're not told about? Just like when we were talking about certain ghaib. Okay, so when you look at nufassilul ayat, that the ayat that were given detail are basically the ones that relate to helping you recognize the path for guidance. So not everything is necessarily going to be known for you, which is why the later ayah would say, وَعِنْدَهُ مَفَاتِحُ الْغَيْبِ لَا يَعْلَمُهَا إِلَّا هُ. So yes, we gave you certain details, but you got to understand that there was certain information in regards to ghaib that's only known for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So what kind of tafsir, what kind of details were we given? He said, وَلِتَسْتَبِينَ سَبِيلُ الْمُجْرِمِينَ. The details that were given to help you basically understand the right vision, to help you understand whether it's your past or whether it's your future, or why you're living. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically sent the key information to help you recognize the path of those that would be out of the parameters of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala / criminals / mujrimeen are basically the ones to commit the sin, and they would be the ones to that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had sent the detailed ayat in order to help you recognize that that's not a path that you would want to be on. So in other words, the reason for the tafsil al-ayat, the reason for why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given us detailed ayat, they were more details in regards to helping you locate your destination, to helping you locate the purpose that precedes your existence, to help you figure out your own creation and what your instinct / your fitra was actually giving you a signal for, because your fitra is definitely created to get certain signals of al-wahi, but your instinct or your fitra can get these signals, but the signals are not enough to basically locate your let's say your destination or where you are on this whole map of life and etc., because this, let's call it, this receptor was actually created right there to only receive those receptors from al-wahi. So if a person is not letting this or deciding to, let's say, turn off this receptor from listening and hearing the wahi, that's when they're basically going to be lost in this sabil, in this path, and then they're basically going to be not capable of figuring out all the different things. So why can't we depend on our mind? Why can't we have science tell us why we were created and who created us and why we're here and what's the destination that we're turning to and all of these different things? So what science is basically all about, it's to help you understand how things function. In other words, your brain is capable of understanding through, of course, with the help of your senses, capable of helping you understand matter in motion. But outside of matter in motion, your brain and also the tools that you have basically are not designed to detect things that are outside of matter in motion. Okay, they're not designed to detect anything outside of matter in motion. In other words, malaika, they're not matter in motion. They're a different type of matter. They're a different type of motion. They engage in different things, and therefore they're not within your capacity or even the tool's capacity that you had designed as a human being to be capable of detecting all the different things that are basically part of al-ghaib. Okay, so al-ghaib, such as Jannah, such as hellfire, such as akhirah, such as even Allah Almighty, is part of ghaib. So if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is part of ghaib, then why would Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala be part of ghaib if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is basically telling us about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Because there's no way that you would even be capable of locating all of this sabil that you're supposed to be recognizing without letting you know of key elements. So those key elements are basically the things such as Allah Almighty, such as the malaika, such as the books that he had revealed onto the prophets, such as the prophets and the messengers, and why they were basically chosen to be in that position, such as al-qada wal-qadar, the different things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had destined before even your creation, and such as Jannah, such as Nar, etc. All of these things, they're actually part of ghaib, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given you some information about these key elements to help you connect certain dots together in order for you to basically know what purpose, in what path you should be basically following or going towards. Now, when you look at your own fitra, your brain, like I said, was only designed to detect things that relate to matter in motion, detect things that basically are within your power to touch, within your power to sense, within your power to see, to measure, all these different things. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not within your power. Neither are the angels. They're not within your power. The past, you can probably look at certain remains and figure out and try to probably create a theory about what happened in these remains, but the jinn, etc., but that's a different world. That's a completely different world with completely different laws of physics, with a completely different laws of biology, with a completely different laws of creation. So therefore, your capability of detecting all this world is basically going to be at a zero. So why would Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala even tell us about this world if we're not capable of detecting it? Why does it even matter if there's jinn around me or there's shayateen around me? Hey, I don't see them, I don't see, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is letting us know that what affects your world is far greater than what you think. What affects you as a human being, what affects your life, whether we're speaking about things in existence or whether we're speaking about things that relate to your spirituality, or whether we're speaking about things that coexist with you. You just need to know that there are certain things that may affect you, may affect your judgment, may affect your life without you even realizing. You can choose to deny it. You can choose to deny it, but facts actually don't come based on what you would want the facts to be. Facts actually come based on what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants them to be. Okay, so when you look at وَلِتَسْتَبِينَ سَبِيلُ الْمُجْرِمِينَ, okay, وَلِتَسْتَبِينَ, and of course the lam is right there in order to give us the reason behind that. And certainly when you look at وَلِتَسْتَبِينَ, istibana, or at least the root is bana, and that would basically mean to bring about clarity. Okay, sabil is basically that one's interesting because the word sabil actually means path. It can also mean water, fountain, or at least like a water spring. That could also be a sabil as well. Okay, but when you look at the word tastabina sabilul mujrimin, is this telling the Prophet ﷺ that he would be aware of the path of those that would basically be considered mujrimin, the criminals, the sinners, the trespassers of boundaries? Okay, is this telling the Prophet ﷺ that the reason why he had sent the ayat, that is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent the ayat and sent the revelation, was in order for him to recognize the path of those that go astray? Or is this talking to the ummah? Who is it really talking to? So generally speaking, العبرة بعموم اللفظ لا بخصوص السبب. We say this frequently. What does that mean? That means that the theme in the ayat, in the wording, is basically dependent on the generalization within the wording of that ayat, and not necessarily the context. So when you look at وَلِتَسْتَبِينَ سَبِيلُ الْمُجْرِمِينَ, you can understand it that it's a general wording directed at me, you, everyone, the Prophet, peace be upon him, every single person. Or you can understand it وَلِتَسْتَبِينَ you, that is the person speaking to the Prophet ﷺ. Okay, but of course the discourse is certainly directed at the Prophet ﷺ, but that's not necessarily exclusive to the Prophet ﷺ. That would be more inclusive to including each and every single person that is reading the Quran. So here's the thing. So when you look at the word sabil, okay, is the word sabil, you look at, why didn't it say sabil al-mu'minin, for example? Okay, there are two responses al-Qurtubi says. He says, well, that's very similar to the ayah sarabila taqikum al-har, when he talked about garments that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had basically blessed us with in order to protect us from the scorching heat. Okay, but why didn't he say, for example, taqikum al-bard? Why didn't he say that it would protect you from cold as well? Okay, now one thing, we could say that sarabila taqikum al-har because the people that were living in definitely in the Arabian Peninsula, they weren't really afraid much of the cold because they could never probably have imagined what it means to be in an 80 below degrees temperature. They probably never thought that that was even possible. Okay. They probably never witnessed of anything this cold. Okay. And definitely they were not that prepared. That's one argument. The second argument, or the second reasoning behind that, is that Sarabila taqikum al-har would also contain, if we're speaking about protecting us from heat, well, the inference would be protecting you from cold as well. So in other words, to protect you from the variant types of temperatures. So in other words, if this is to protect you from heat, well, certainly you've got garments, inevitably, they're definitely also going to be protecting you from cold as well, because we would know that. But this is in order to bring about an answer. Why didn't say لتستبين سبيل المؤمنين and not سبيل المجرمين and not سبيل المؤمنين? So the first response was, well, this would be the inference. But then the ayah didn't necessarily say سبيل المؤمنين, but that's because if you were to know what is wrong, then you would basically know what is right. If you're capable of distinguishing the wrong path, then definitely you would be capable of figuring out the right path, because you knew that that was the wrong thing to do. Now, here's one thing. It's quite interesting. I personally didn't know that one. Is sabil a feminine, basically a masculine or a feminine word? Now, in Lugha Arabiya, just a note, okay? In Lugha Arabiya, there are certain words that are masculine and feminine, just like in other languages. In Hebrew, that's the case. In French, I know that that is the case because I studied French. That's the same thing, and then, French is one of those confusing things that was the thing about the feminine and the masculine and the masculine, all of that. And you end up basically, as a person that is not authentically French, you'll end up basically making those mistakes and trying to figure out whether this is supposed to be a feminine or masculine. In Lugha Arabiya, there are some words also. I guess in Lugha Arabiya, I must say, I think it's a lot easier than French, or maybe because I'm Arabi, maybe this is a bias statement. But in Lugha Arabiya, it's a lot easier to recognize, to figure out a word that is feminine or masculine. Okay. But when you say a word that is feminine or masculine, okay, that doesn't necessarily mean that that is in any shape or form that it is giving it honor. Okay. Not in any way. Or that this in itself is actually feminine or masculine. So that's why when you're looking at Shams and al-Qamar, okay, al-Qamar is not necessarily going to be less because it is a feminine with a feminine pronoun. Or is it Shams that's feminine pronoun? All right, هذه الشمس. Okay, هذه الشمس, that's a feminine pronoun. And هذا القمر, okay, there you go, that's a masculine right there. All right, now the question is, what about a sabil? There are certain words that actually take both pronouns. Wait a minute, so they're what do they call those that take both pronouns? What do they call them right now? What do they call them? What do they call these people that actually take both pronouns? Tell me, with these LGBT stuff, they're always talking about these type of people that take both pronouns. Okay. Give me the word. I can't forget it. I can't remember it. Okay. So in Lugha Arabiya, Sabil actually takes both pronouns. Okay. And it takes the masculine and the feminine pronoun. And you had a tribe called Tamim. They used to use more of the masculine pronoun, And Ahl al-Hijaz, basically, Ahl al-Hijaz are pretty much within the Arabian Peninsula. Well, actually, also are Tamim. But Ahl al-Hijaz, we're talking about Medina and within that area. They used to give it that ta'neeth. But you could see that in the Quran, it actually used both pronouns. Okay. We use both pronouns for the word sabil. So in Surah, for example, Sajda, Surah Al-A'raf, sorry. وَيَرَوْا سَبِيلَ الرُّشْدِ لَا يَتَّخِذُوهُ سَبِيلًا. So the word يَتَّخِذُوهُ was actually masculine. That basically goes back to يَتَّخِذُ what? It's basically يَتَّخِذُ السَّبِيل. Okay, but you could see that it was actually a masculine pronoun right there. لما تصدون عن سبيل الله من آمن تبغونها عوجا. You could see on the other hand, this sabil right here was actually given a feminine pronoun in Surah Ali Imran. Okay, and he said, and that's why in the qira'at, the word وَلِتَسْتَبِينَ سَبِيلُ الْمُجْرِمِينَ was actually read in both qira'at, وَلِتَسْتَبِينَ and وَلِيَسْتَبِينَ سَبِيلُ الْمُجْرِمِينَ. Okay, so I want you to see that one, that sometimes the qira'at are taking consideration the different rules in Lugha Arabiya. So the one qira'ah said وَلِيَسْتَبِينَ سَبِيلُ الْمُجْرِمِينَ and the other qira'ah وَلِتَسْتَبِينَ سَبِيلُ الْمُجْرِمِينَ. Why did it use those two qira'at? Well, because in Lugha Arabiya, the masculine, at least the gender, or at least the pronoun for sabil is feminine and masculine, depending on the tribe that is using it. Okay, let's see. قُلْ إِنِّي نُهِيتُ أَنْ أَعْبُدَ الَّذِينَ تَدْعُونَ مِن دُونِ اللَّهِ. You know, the word that I was actually looking for, it's on the tip of my tongue. What do they call that? I don't know why my brain keeps going into the bipolar word. It's not it. Bipolar is a mental disorder, but it just doesn't want to get over it. What is that? Non-binary. That's the word. Why didn't anybody tell me about it? Okay, so I guess Sabila is non-binary. Okay, here we go. قل إني نهيت أن أعبد الذين تدعون من دون الله قل لا أتبع أهواءكم قد ضللت إذا وما أنا من المهتدين. A couple of things to say here. I want you to look at the word قل and I want you to look at the word قل. Okay, why is that important? Whenever you would see the word قل, it basically has, number one, it has some isti'la in it. It has this type of isti'la, this type of pride that comes with it. And it also is asking us to repeat something, and with the repetition comes along with it a certain relationship, a certain programming, and certainly the people that surround you, they would recognize that that's basically your wording, that they would recognize that you're saying this. It's a form of communication for sure. Because when you say قل, it's an imperative verb in ordering us to say something specific. Okay. Now, when you say قل and it's telling me what to say, and it's giving me a specific wording to respond or to say or to announce. Respond, announce, say, probably argue, refute, whatever it is, all of these different things are also mentioned in other ayat. If you were to, I guess, do this type of jar, then you were to look at all those different ayat that had قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ. There's that informative clause. So now it's giving me that information. Another qul would tell you, I want you to use this response. Another qul is basically with that inference is telling you, I want you to live that psychology. I want you to live the psychology of you teaching, of you instructing, of you informing, of you doing the dawah, of you, etc. The list goes on and on. So let's just say and analyze what these two quls want us, and let's look at that speech. إِنِّي نُهِيتُ أَنْ أَعْبُدَ الَّذِينَ تَدْعُونَ مِن دُونِ اللَّهِ. I was ordered or I was actually not ordered, but I was forbidden to worship those that you would تدعون من دون الله. Now, the word تدعون can actually mean to invoke and could also mean to worship. So when it says I was ordered or I was forbidden, why do I keep on saying ordered? I was forbidden from worshiping what you would pray to outside of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In other words, to other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay. Now, the other tad'una could also mean ta'buduna, could also mean to worship. So in other words, I was forbidden from worshiping whatever you would worship other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay. So here's the thing. When the word duna actually means a couple things. Duna can mean other than, and duna can mean lower than. Okay. So when min dunillah, lower than, then it's basically saying, well, everything that you would worship is lower than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and therefore I would not want to worship other than something that is high. I want you to look at this one, because this is a very important thing. Notice that the word dun is basically to emphasize that what they are worshiping is of less. What they are worshiping does not have that honor. And at the same time, when you say nuhitu, in other words, I basically got the order from above. And this order that is from the above is basically telling me to say it, to announce it. In other words, announce what? Announce the authority that you turn to, which is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Announce that authority. Announce what you were forbidden from doing. And let them know that you are in a position of pride, and that let them recognize that you regard their lifestyle, whether we're speaking about religion or whether we're speaking about culture, that that's inferior, that you regard it as inferior. This is extremely important, that you as a Muslim come in with the pride of faith, a pride in keeping in mind there's a certain legislature that you basically connect with, and therefore this pride is giving you a connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and it's not only in regards to worship, but it's also in regards to where they seek security from, where they would seek help from. In other words, all the different things that they connect to, whether it's a philosophy in legislation, or a philosophy in I guess the way that life was created or whatever it is, or a philosophy here and there, the social philosophy or whatever it is, all these different things, we would see it as tad'una min dunillah. Now watch why are we saying tad'una min dunillah and ta'buduna as well. Ta'buduna is not a different qira'ah, okay? But I want you to just see the word tad'una is more comprehensive than just to invoke, than just to seek support from, or to take a time to probably make the dua for, because this is more comprehensive. The word tad'una is more comprehensive because it would include all types of claiming authority, and whether we're speaking about social authority, or whether we're speaking about financial or economical or political or whatever it is, that it basically goes to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and therefore you announce it, that you take your authority from above. You take your authority from Allahu Akbar. So that's the first thing. And then قُلْ لَا أَتَّبِعُ أَهْوَاءَكُمْ, and say, I do not follow your whims. But a couple of things here. So number one is that you could say Al-Qurtubi said تدعون بمعنى تعبدون, which basically would carry the meaning of to worship. Okay, so then it says that it was mentioned by other mufassirin that you تدعونهم في مهمات أموركم على جهة العبادة أراد بذلك الأصنام. In other words, this is letting them know the reality and the implications of what they are worshiping. And this is extremely important. When you look at a lot of the different philosophies out there, whether you're speaking about, you're speaking about, for example, atheism. A lot of times people would talk about atheism as just this person, he doesn't believe in God, but he's really nice. Okay. But then a lot of the atheists are actually atheists because they don't really recognize the implication, and this is extremely important, the implication of their ideology on, if we were to apply it on, one, the definition of justice, on their life, on the society. That would be basically suicide for, one, their mental health, their life, etc., and certainly justice, all of these different things. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala lets us be aware to let us, in these ayat, let us bring about that transparency, at least clear to them. Let them see the implication of what they are worshiping, or the implication of what they are behaving in. And right now, especially, we can do a lot of studies to help them see beyond their interpretation. Now, this is extremely important because when you look at, especially psychology, for example, they'll do a certain study, a certain survey, and then they'll say, okay, here's the interpretation. Now, here's one thing. 90% of those studies are actually funded by certain groups. And 90% of those studies that are funded by certain groups are basically going to be in support of those certain groups. So when you look at a certain, for example, think tank, the think tank basically is a feminist think tank, for example, okay? Not all think tanks are feminist, but okay. Let's say a certain think tank is a feminist think tank. So then they would study possibly maybe the impact getting married young on these girls, and how it basically destroys their life, it destroys their future, all of these. So then they'll create questionnaires, or probably study those cases that support the prelude that they had really wanted to support, which is, we don't want women getting married young. We need to raise the age up to 18, and now some are talking about 21. So in other words, open the door for friendship, zina, etc. Let them first discover before they get into marriage. And then, of course, you had also other feminists that basically take Simone de Beauvoir's vision that marriage is nothing but a social contract that imprisons women, and that it's not necessarily in favor for women, and that it was somehow coming from a certain culture that enslaved women. Okay. And certainly considered later on the implication of what she had said. I mean, Simone de Beauvoir didn't even end up just at that circle, but she considered that the most thing that you could support women with is to exacerbate them from their body, literally. So it's like you're separating a woman from her own womb, that's the best gift that you could give her. That's basically why she considered that not having children, and that children basically end up becoming those tools that women end up needing to live for, and then they end up basically ditching them, etc. In other words, a society that they're living in as a kafir. Okay, now you're going to use that as the area to study the whole human race, and you're going to use that as the definition of how we would interpret your values, how we would interpret the right, quote unquote, the right values and what things should be looking like. So that's why it's extremely important to recognize when we use those studies, who is funding these studies, what is the prelude that they were basically considering, and who is this interpretation basically supporting. Okay, and that's why it's really important to expose those studies. And oftentimes, the students, especially the undergrad, they don't really recognize all of these backends in these studies. They would just say, well, the study said this and a study said that. They don't even recognize that, not just because it was said that it was a study, it doesn't necessarily make it objective, doesn't necessarily make it unbiased, it doesn't necessarily make it that that's the complete truth. But for a Muslim, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given us the lens to help us see the studies basically before they would be interpreted, and say, well, here's the lens that I want you to look through in order to recognize the truth, in order to recognize basically the right and wrong, in order to recognize where you should be at within this whole thing that you could be seeing, that you could be interpreting, that you could be basically trying to figure out, etc. So that's that tad'una min dunillah. This isn't just talking about exposing the implication of their ideology and creed, but this is also telling us to go farther. لا أتبع أهواءكم قد ضللت إذا. So now when you look at here, قل لا أتبع أهواءكم, I do not follow your whims, and then قد ضللت إذا وما أنا من المهتدين. وما أنا من المهتدين. So when you look at قد ضللت إذا, that's in order to tell us to expose and speak from above, to expose, one, the creed that the ideology, the creed that they are embracing, and number two, basically the path or the implication, the culture, etc., and what that actually means in terms of its implication, its effect on society, etc., then you would have to do that job and create, and this is extremely important, to create institutions or think tanks that basically support, let's say, an objective, number one, and two, that come from the lens of Quran and Sunnah. Yes, certainly. We need to have institutions and think tanks, not only that support Islam in the way where we're speaking about supporting literally Quran and Sunnah, but we're speaking about institutions, their job, yes, they are coming from the Quran and Sunnah, but to perhaps maybe hire the students that studied psychology and teach them how to not fall for basically those influences, whether it's a feminist or whether atheist or probably, just different groups, and postmodern or Western, liberal, whatever it is, all of these different areas, and to basically let them read all of those studies based on Quran and Sunnah, and basically create newer studies with newer interpretation that basically reads it from the lens of Quran and Sunnah. And this is something that we really are behind. So you would have certain institutions, for example, that are Christian-based. You would have atheist-based institutions that probably work in psychology, or probably work in science, or probably work in different fields, but we don't have a single Muslim institution that is funded. And you want to keep in mind that funding these institutions is extremely important, because those would be nonprofit organizations. In other words, these people are going to be by 100% dependent on the funding, dependent on the donations that run these programs. That's the same thing when you look at American Enterprise Institute, you look at RAND, you look at the different think tanks out there. They would be funded by sometimes trillions of dollars, and sometimes billions of dollars, and sometimes we're speaking about big money. Okay, of course, trillions we're speaking about, that's in all. Okay, but they would be funded by millions and millions of dollars. Okay, so if they are funded like that, what are we doing? Unfortunately, our society is continuously just right now nothing but a consumer to these sold studies. And that's definitely dangerous, because if we become consumers to these sold, claimed studies, then we end up really feeding on someone else's culture. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us that no, you have to be at the upper level and exposing the ideology to exposing the culture and what the implications of that culture and how it leads to dalal, and how it leads to basically losing the path, and how it leads to people basically getting their own hidayah basically gone wrong. So when you look at قَدْ ضَلَلْتُ إِذًا وَمَا أَنَا مِنَ الْمُهْتَدِينَ. So why didn't it just say قَدْ ضَلَلْتُ إِذًا and that's it, and not وَمَا أَنَا مِنَ الْمُهْتَدِينَ? Why, an increased thing? It's kind of like saying, well, I would be led astray, and that would mean I wouldn't be a part of those that were guided. So why the repetition? In Lugha Arabiya, it's important to remember that in Lugha Arabiya, it carries a different structure. It carries a different structure than in English. So in English, that would be poor English, but in Lugha Arabiya, repetition is for a number of different reasons. There's number one, there's a reason for repetition to emphasize something. Okay. Another reason for repetition is to basically bring in more clarity. In other words, to bring in more information, and to bring in more information is to basically make that obvious and make it clear. In other words, it's a form of scrutiny. So when you say قَدْ ضَلَلْتُ إِذَا وَمَا أَنَا الْمُهْتَدِينَ, in other words, it was saying, well, let's look at it. If we were to follow your whims, whether in interpreting justice, or whether it's in interpreting the lifestyle, or interpreting the world around us, etc., well, if we were to follow your whims, your interpretation, then certainly we would be astray. وَمَا أَنَا مِنَ الْمُهْتَدِينَ. And in that situation, the inference is that I would not be guided. What does that really mean? That's to say that if a person, because it was saying before that, وَلِتَسْتَبِينَ سَبِيلُ الْمُجْرِمِينَ, it was letting you know what it means to bring about clarity in order for you to distinguish the path of those that had gone astray from the ones that basically had found the right path and done what is right. So that's why it basically continued to explain what this looks like. So we explained it to you and said, okay, well, first you want to look at creed and what it carries. Then I want you to look at what lifestyle you're doing in repetition. Well, wait a minute. Why did I say repetition? Well, because of Lugha Arabiya, when you look at that attabi'u, you see that? It could have said, قُلْ لَا أَتْبَعُ أَهْوَاءَكُمْ. Okay, that's a proper sentence right there, but it didn't say that. It said, قُلْ لَا أَتَّبِعُ. Why? It can happen that a person may at times slip, but the biggest influence would be in situations where you take a continuous action in following the whims. In other words, you make that as a lifestyle. You make that as a lifestyle. But here, قُلْ لَا أَتَّبِعُ, that shadda right there is to emphasize that I'm not going to continuously or even gradually or even be determined to follow your whims. Why il-hawa? What is il-hawa? Il-hawa can mean il-hawa, so now we're talking about this one, okay? Il-hawa generally means a person's desires. What does that mean? A person's desires basically means a person liking something, a person having a sentiment of pleasure towards something, and then they basically would be attracted to it. Okay, that's al-hawa. So when you say قُلْ لَا أَتَّبِعُ أَهْوَاءَكُمْ, that's basically to scrutinize the disbelievers. Not only did they not have their resources in place, but that is also to say they were left to their own whims to determine their path, because they did not actually have the right resources in place. And that's the same thing when we were talking about psychology earlier, for example. We said that if a person, if you look at, for example, the different studies and etc., if you don't know who the funding group is, and then you end up just taking, that there's a study that says that XYZ. Okay, and then you end up thinking, oh my God, there's actually a study, this is what science is proving, and all of that, and you would think of it as an objective thing and not realize that not too fast. Can we see the questions that you had written? How straightforward were they? How were these questionnaires? How were these people that you had studied? And that's why you look at a lot of these studies were actually made on one upper class, white and liberal societies usually. Okay. And that's definitely in Western. And then what do you end up with? You end up with definitely a study that is not necessarily a fair study. They would, let's say, announce that they're making a study at, let's say, University of Michigan or whatever it is, and this study involves this, but you made this study at University of Michigan, and you basically had studied, let's say, 500 people, okay? And within these 500 people, the ones that showed up is going to be determined based on where you put that announcement in. That's number one. Number two, most of those people that would come in are usually the people that come probably within campus, around campus, and probably it depends on where you put the flyer at in order to draw these people. And perhaps you said, hey, I'll give you a $20 voucher if you were to come and take this study and participate in the study. And of course, it attracted certain people, but or those that would understand the importance of the study. But you still end up that you only studied the people, or at least within a certain community, with a certain group. Therefore, it's not necessarily completely objective. Now, when you look at قُلْ لَا أَتَّبِعُ أَهْوَاءَكُمْ, الْهَوَى is anything that a person might desire. So if they don't have their resource in place, then definitely they're going to be dependent on something else to interpret the world around them, to interpret right and wrong, to interpret what positions and what paths they take, and all of that. And that's basically going to be il-hawa. What they were seeking is something that the idea, the philosophy is maximizing happiness. That's what they would say. It's to maximize happiness. It's to maximize pleasure. It's finding the highest level of pleasure. So therefore, they would consider that if you're maximizing happiness, you're maximizing pleasure, that's an evidence to prove that something is good for you. That's what the whole idea is about. But Islam tells you, actually, that's actually not accurate. It's not pleasure that basically reflects whether something is right and wrong. We can actually need something that is painful, and that's probably even better for us at times. So the whole theory of maximizing pleasure is basically right there. قُلْ لَا أَتَّبِعُ أَهْوَاءَكُمْ. Say, I don't follow your whims. I don't follow your desires. I don't follow your theory that we're supposed to be maximizing pleasure as much as we can. Because that theory basically comes from those feelings trying to seek and search for pleasure, but pleasure, we would know, is something that can put us in a delusion. It can put us in a delusion. We can eat sugar and it feels good to eat sugar, and then you eat sugar and then, oh, I got a stomachache after sugar. Or I probably got, I don't know, an increase in sugar level, became diabetic from eating too much sugar, probably for a number of different factors, whatever. But certainly, قد ضللت. When you look at الضلال, what is الضلال? الضلال is deviance. What is deviance? So deviance is going off the path. What path? The path that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had structured the world in. Okay. If you say structured the world in, what does that mean? Well, that means that there's a certain paradigm that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created, whether in nature, whether in the universe, whether in your body, whether in the social structure, whether in everything that you basically see around you, it depends on a certain structure. If you were to go outside of that structure, that basically means you had gone outside of the structure that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had wanted you to be within its parameters. That's al-dalal. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then would give us وَمَا أَنَا مِنَ الْمُهْتَدِينَ. If I were to follow this delusion that is based on, yes, I'm maximizing pleasure, then in that situation, you would basically be a person, وَمَا أَنَا مِنَ الْمُهْتَدِينَ. You would not be a person within the parameter of guidance. So what is that then, that repetition right there supposed to be giving us? It was supposed to be giving us a further explanation that if a person is living in this delusion based on whims and maximizing in search of pleasure, then in that situation, they would find themselves in a delusion, and certainly this delusion is going to lead them outside of the perimeter of guidance, meaning not only in this life, but even in the hereafter. So then it comes to give us further details on, well, so you recognize La ilaha. Now I want you to emphasize and basically bring in a new assertion here. So what is that going to be now confirming? You can't just say, I am not worshiping such, I'm not following your whims, and I would be in delusion, etc., because that's a good foundation. That's a good start to recognize that their resources are wrong. That's a good start to recognize that their implication of life and the lifestyle they're living is wrong. Now I want you to recognize the alternative. After you had denounced all that lifestyle, now I want you to bring in the alternative. First, and this is extremely important for those that are doing dawah, before you would engage in proving Islam is the right religion, you first have to start on letting them recognize that what they're following is basically a delusion, that what they're following is basically not containing the truth. That's the first start. You first have to let them see the wrong, and let them recognize that the lifestyle that they have chosen to embrace, that the ideology that they had chosen to embrace as well, is basically containing 1, 2, 3 faults, containing 1, 2, 3 implications, and containing 1, 2, 3 delusions, etc. Okay, so now we could see this one. Now, as a Muslim, then you're going to be bringing the alternative. for yourself and for those that you're doing da'wah to. قُلْ إِنِّي عَلَى بَيِّنَةٍ. Now, of course, we had mentioned before that in Surah Al'anam, there were a lot of quls, and here we come again to the same way. قُلْ إِنِّي عَلَى بَيِّنَةٍ مِّن رَبِّي. Say, I am on a clear matter from my Lord Almighty. Okay? وَكَذَّبْتُمْ بِهِ. But you had denied it. ما عندي ما تستعجلون به. I don't have what you're rushing to, basically, what you're rushing to do, and what you're rushing not to do, but what you're rushing to happen. Okay? And وَكَذَّبْتُمْ بِهِ. And you had denied it. ما عندي ما تستعجلون به إن الحكم إلا لله. For the ruling is for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The judgment is for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. يقص الحق. يقص or يقضي الحق. Two different قراءات. يقص and يقضي. When you say يقص الحق, what is يقص? I thought يقص actually means to cut. So how is it that it could also mean to say a story? What's the relationship between cutting and saying a story? Because when you cut something, you're going in it, gradually in order to cut it. Okay? You're cutting, you use the scissors, and you could say that in order to cut, you basically cut more from the angle, and you don't cut from the beginning of that scissor. You understand what I'm saying? And that's why you realize that the portion that's really cutting is really the beginning, let's say the corner, maybe I should draw that, right? Okay, if this is a scissor, how am I going to do this? Okay, no, let me use it on this side. Okay, if this is a scissor, for example, okay, this is a scissor, and then you bring in like a fabric, okay, you would say that the part that is at the angle, once that angle basically gets attaches and connects this one, that's when this part starts cutting, and then the rest of those ends start later on basically putting in the cutting as well. That's why when you look at يقص الحق, it's basically letting you recognize the beginning of how these stories unfold, because when they cut, they basically unfold. They basically open up. All right? They basically unfold. And that's why يقص actually means, one, to cut, because it's unfolding, it's separating these two ends when you're cutting, and two, it's basically letting you see the story as if you're going inside and you're unfolding the story, and you're unfolding. And that's why يقص also means to say a story. يقص means to tell a story, okay? And يقص means to cut. What is the relationship? Is that you're going inside, penetrating inside that story little by little to see how it unfolds, and you live it. اللغة العربية is beautiful. It's just beyond. Okay. And in يقضي الحق, in that other qira'ah, actually means he rules. He basically announces a certain, with his majesty, basically announces a certain qada, a certain judgment, makes a final statement, makes a judgment, and that is al-haq, that is the truth. وَهُوَ خَيْرُ الْفَاصِلِينَ, and he is basically the best of those that would separate between the two. Okay, now let's look at a couple things here. قُلْ إِنِّي عَلَى بَيِّنَةٍ مِّن رَبِّي. Say, I am on a bayyina. What is al-bayyina? Well, of course, and قُلْ إِنِّي first. When you say قُلْ, announcing, say, I am عَلَى بَيِّنَةٍ. I am on a clear matter from my Lord Almighty. And that clear matter is basically La ilaha illallah. So in terms of the contrast. You were worshiping other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but my foundation is based on La ilaha illallah. Okay, that's the first one. And the second piece of it is to basically attabi' what am I following in terms of legislature? I'm basically following the Sharia. Now, to contrast, and that's ala bayyina. What is al-bayyina? Al-bayyina is clarity. It basically comes from bana, and now it takes us back to this verb right here, right? And takes us right here. Because it told you, it was telling you, لِتَسْتَبِينَ سَبِيلُ الْمُجْرِمِينَ. It used the same exact word and said, well, I want you to make it clear. I want you to see things clearly. And yes, we certainly would give you tafsil. We would give you the details. And these details would basically contain the clarity. These details would contain the clarity, would contain the necessary elements for you to help recognize basically from your Lord Almighty where you're heading in order to make sure that you would not live a delusion. When it said وَكَذَّبْتُمْ بِهِ, but we already know that they had denied it. Why emphasize that they had already denied it? This isn't news. They themselves know that they had denied it. So, it's like, okay, we already know that. This isn't to tell them that hey, this is what you are doing. But this is actually to expose the fault that they're living in. Okay? So this isn't giving them information about what they already know of. This is exposing that in response to you, and you recognize truth, but in response, you should be guilty for denying all of this. Okay, that's the inference. ما عندي ما تستعجلون به. I don't have what you are expediting. Wait a minute. How did we get into this? How did we get into وكذبتم به and then ما عندي ما تستعجلون به? The inference is they basically had said, well, if you're on such a bayina, if you're in such clarity, then you know what? Why don't you punish us right away? Why don't you expedite our punishment if you can? If you had the power and you claim that you have the ability and you're basically spoken to by God, then okay, why don't you show us that power and expedite a punishment for us right now, right before our eyes? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, I don't have that power. That's not within my authority as a prophet to do. My authority, in al-hukmu illa lillah. My authority is just to tell you that the power, the judgment is basically coming back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What is that letting us know? Well, that's basically taking us right there to let us know that when we speak, and this is extremely important, look at this one. In al-hukmu illa lillah, maybe I can make this one bigger for a bit. Okay, when you look at in al-hukmu illa lillah, that's basically taking us right there. Remember when they were, coming in with a different aqidah, with a wrong aqidah, and then basically with a wrong sharia, with a wrong legislation that they were worshipping. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, well, I want you to let them know inni ala bayyinatin min rabbi, that you're on a clear path in terms of your definition, your understanding, who really your Lord Almighty is, etc. And then in al-hukmu illa lillah, it's not enough to believe in God. It's not enough to believe in Allah, but there's a certain lifestyle that you really have to embrace, and that's why he said in al-hukmu illa lillah, because that's in opposition to the lifestyle that is based on hawa that they are living in. Okay? So this is extremely important, because you would see a lot of people that are like, on the inside, I'm such a great believer, I'm such a great Muslim, good for you. But if you're not putting it into practice, then are you really living in a delusion yourself? Are you really just wanting yourself to live in this hypocrisy on the inside of Muslim, but your actions are basically away from Islam and away from Hukm Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? If that is so, then this person is really in big trouble. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, يَقُصُّ الْحَقِّ. Why يَقُصُّ الْحَقِّ? We had mentioned that يَقُصُّ الْحَقِّ is basically to bring about clarity. يَقُصُّ الْحَقِّ is to bring about basically the separation. Okay, so two things. The first qira'ah says يَقُصُّ الْحَقِّ, and the qira'ah that says يَقُصُّ الْحَقِّ said that basically that would be a qira'ah that we would prefer, okay, over يَقْضِي الْحَقِّ. Why? They said, I mean, when you say يَقُصُّ الْحَقِّ, يَقُصُّ actually means to cut, but it also can mean to inform you. Then they said, and our evidence, and it's not like a debate that they're, that let's just say not evidence, but let's just say their reason for support, a reason for supporting this or liking or preferring this qira'ah. They said when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَهُوَ خَيْرُ الْفَاصِلِينَ, when you say وَهُوَ خَيْرُ الْفَاصِلِينَ, what's a fasil? Al-fasil is a separator. Al-fasil is a separator. The Lord Almighty being the best of the separators, separator from what? From right and wrong. If the Lord Almighty is the best of those that would separate from right and wrong, they said, well, that comes with, hey, it comes with yaqussu. It comes with to cut something, to separate something, to inform you of something, is to basically also to let you unfold different things. That's the first one. يَقْضِي الْحَقِّ. Why did you say that? Well, they said, we prefer and we like that qira'ah. And they said, well, because if you were to continue, first of all, what does yaqdi mean? Now, in terms of writing, when you say yaqdi, that would mean that there's going to be a dot right there, okay? And then it would look like yaqdi, and certainly the dhamma would basically be a kasra right there, okay? Yaqussu would basically look a little different because it would have the same structure, but without the dot and certainly without dhamma. But you want to keep in mind, in Lugha Arabiya, at least historically speaking, they didn't actually have these aqsa and these harakat right there at the time. So the structure would look like this, okay? In other words, but if it were yaqdi, then we would have a yaqdi al-haq, okay? Because that would be right there, this fi'l mudari', and certainly the fi'l mudari' did not have anything that that preceded it from nasb or jazm, so then therefore it would be yaqdi, okay? But then, anyhow, but it can happen that in Lugha Arabiya as well, the present tense may sometimes also be as basically a pronoun that is, or not a pronoun, but what do we say, a preposition that is omitted. Okay, so the ones that said we prefer the qira'ah yaqdi al-haq. Yaqdi means to judge. Yaqdi means to rule. They said, here's what our evidence is. The following ayah, it said, قُلْ لَوْ أَنَّ عِنْدِي مَا تَسْتَعْجِلُونَ بِهِ لَقُضِيَ الْأَمْرُ بَيْنِي وَبَيْنَكُمْ وَاللَّهُ أَعْلَمُ بِالظَّالِمِينَ. The following ayah says, and say, if I had what you had wanted to expedite, that is, they wanted to expedite punishment, ironically. They wanted to expedite punishment. You know, you would expedite maybe to get Jannah, but expedite punishment? That is so ironic. But you could say, subhanAllah, when people are distant away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they could really expedite even their own halak, even their own destruction. So then they said, لَقُضِيَ, then the Lord Almighty, لَقُضِيَ الْأَمْرُ بَيْنِي وَبَيْنَكُم. If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically had expedited your punishment, then of course, لَقُضِيَ الْأَمْرُ بَيْنِي وَبَيْنَكُم. That's the end of the relationship between me and you. The relationship between me and you is that I was here, sent as a prophet, to basically inform you of a punishment or a Jannah basically coming later in your life. And what's going to determine your position is the choice that you're making in this life. So if you are punished, then that's the end of everything. Then I won't, my duty, my role would right now be basically that's the end of my position. My position and my job is basically to inform you that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to be holding you accountable, that you are basically created for a purpose, and that you are supposed to be living these principles of the Lord Almighty. Wallahu alam bil-zalimin. The Lord Almighty knows who al-zalimin is. So they then basically, you look at وَعِنْدَهُ مَفَاتِحُ الْغَيْبِ لَا يَعْلَمُهَا إِلَّا هُ. So they said, okay, well, tell us then. That's the inference. Notice that the ayat would give the responses and not necessarily always say what comes into their mind or what they had said, because the statement that they had made is not worthy of mention. Only at certain times will the ayat say, well, this is what they had said, and here is the response to it, in order for us to really know what the context for that is. Okay, so then the context continues and tells us, وَعِنْدَهُ مَفَاتِحُ الْغَيْبِ لَا يَعْلَمُهَا إِلَّا هُ. So the Lord Almighty, عِنْدَهُ مَفَاتِحُ الْغَيْبِ, He basically has all the different keys to al-ghaib. What is al-ghaib? Al-ghaib, anything, the root is ghaba. Ghaba means to be absent. Ghaba means to be absent. So anything that is absent from you is basically considered ghaib. Even if you were, let's say right now, what's happening in, I don't know, Iran, what's happening in Palestine, etc. You don't really know everything, at least, you've got some certain media, certain social media, it's probably, telling you certain pieces of information, but you don't fully know what's happening in Gaza or Palestine or Iran or etc. and what's going to happen, within that area. You don't really know everything. Okay, that would be considered ghaib. Okay, but al-ghaib is not necessarily only of things that are, let's call it metaphysical, beyond metaphysics, beyond nature. Okay, it's not only that, because al-ghaib is anything that is absent from you, anything that you cannot basically have at that moment, at least, access to. So when it said وَعِنْدَهُ مَفَاتِحُ الْغَيْبِ, and the Lord Almighty عِنْدَهُ, the word عِنْدَ, a preposition actually means next to him. Okay, and it could also mean with him. Okay, and what is mafatih? Mafatih basically means keys. The root is fataha, which means open. The root is to opened. Fataha, open. So mafatihu, okay, would basically mean the keys to opening, well, the keys to opening and revealing anything that is unseen, anything that is absent. So he has the keys, and then لا يعلمها إلا هو, and he would, no one would know it but him. Okay, so two things here. What is it noting? If you look into this ayah, let's just look at it. Okay, so this ayah basically tells us two key things. Number one, عنده, basically reflecting that he owns it. Okay, he owns what? Well, he owns mafatih al-ghaib. He owns the different keys to al-ghaib. So what does that really mean? What is al-ghaib? الغيب basically means anything that is unseen. So مفاتيح الغيب, then لا يعلمها إلا هو, that's to let us know not only does he control the elements, but even their function is basically under the control of the Lord Almighty. Because he said, لا يعلمها إلا هو. In other words, the element itself is in the hands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and plus the way to control whether how things function or why they function, or it's sort of, in other words, the whole thing that puts these keys together, it's basically only by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَيَعْلَمُ مَا فِي الْبَرِّ وَالْبَحْرِ. And the Lord Almighty knows what is on land and what is in sea. Wait a minute. So why لا يعلمها إلا هو? And then emphasizing again, he knows what's on land and what's on sea. Why land and sea? Why not, for example, maybe on Mars? Okay. Why not there? So when you say يعلم ما في البر والبحر, it's because they had access to البر. They had access to land. والبحر, they had some access to it. So you wanted something that they have hands-on. With these hands-on, to let them know that one, the control of things, two, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that basically has the power to connect all the different ghaib together. All the different ghaib together, meaning whether we're talking about the past, we're talking about the future, we're talking about you yourself, we're talking about the different things, that different elements that surround you and how they relate to you, how you relate to the future, how you relate to Jannah, Nar, your life, etc. All of that, it's basically mafatihul ghaib. They're the keys, they're elements that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala controls. Well, not only does he control the element, but he also controls and knows how these elements were set together. Not only that, but to give you a picture, and that's why the ayah basically continued to give us an idea of what that looks like. Said, يَعْلَمُ مَا فِي الْبَرِّ وَالْبَحْرِ. He would know what's on land and what's on sea. Okay, matter, so he knows what's there. Well, not only does he know the matter that is there, but he would also know the function that they would be in. What does that look like? So even if a leaf would fall, it would basically be falling with the Lord Almighty knowing that it had fell, and plus it would basically be within Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's will. Okay, so what are you saying? Every single matter on land and deep in the sea, and even every single function, every single motion, so not only matter, but even the motion that may take place of probably a falling leaf, إِلَّا يَعْلَمُهَا. The Lord Almighty would know it. I mean, how small can we go? He said, وَلَا حَبَّةٍ, and not even a seed, whether it was in ظُلُمَاتِ الْأَرْضِ, in the different darknesses within the different pieces, or the different, what do they call those parts on earth? Well, even if it's basically within those darknesses, and not even الرطب, not even something that is moist, or something that is يابس, something that is hard, إلا في كتاب مبين. But it was actually mentioned in a kitab mubin, kitab, in a book that basically had all the details, all the clarity of what would happen. All the details of what would happen. So what is that supposed to let me know? And why tell me this now? Well, that was because they wanted to respond to the Prophet ﷺ. Remember, the ayah didn't tell me what their objection was, but their objection we could see from the response. You know, if I were to tell you, you know, I'm not sure what the question was in here, but you would say, well, what was the answer? I'm 20 years old. Oh, you would say, well, obviously, the question was, how old are you? Right? I can figure out what the question was or what they tried to put in as rebuttals, or they thought that they were putting in as rebuttals, but then the AI is giving me these responses and tell me, okay, well, here's the response to this. The response is 1, 2, 3. So the response is to letting us know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is basically the one that has all the different control in matter, and he would know that matter, and he would even know all the details, whether land or sea, meaning that whether it's on the surface or whether it's deep in the sea. So land meaning surface, sea meaning deep, meaning inside, and ما تسقط من ورقة إلا يعلمها. You were to compare, and even if it's something that is falling, or whether it's something that is idle, something that is stagnant, probably some seed that is in earth, or whether something that probably has a different texture. We're talking about maybe moist. Another one has a texture of probably maybe being solid. Everything is basically mentioned in the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Why bringing me these contrasts? Bringing in the contrast of things, and whether we're speaking about something idle, something basically maybe the texture of moisture, the texture of probably heat, the texture of up, down, inside, left, texture of probably movement, texture of probably something stagnant, whatever it is. Why bringing me all of that's to show encompassment. That's to show encompassment. Same thing when you look at the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You look at the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, al-awwal, al-akhir. He's the beginning and he's the last. Well, wait a minute. So is God contradictory? He's either the beginning or the last. No, that's to show encompassment. That's to tell you that he's the beginning and nothing was before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He's the last and nothing was after Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and nothing shall be after Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's to let you know that he encompasses time. He encompasses place. He's basically al-Zahir and al-Batin. He's the apparent, and he's also the one that basically is capable of knowing and basically having the power of deep inside of things. That's in order to let you know that the Lord Almighty's power basically goes outside and inside, and his power encompasses all areas. And that's the same thing. That's that area, mafatihul ghaib. It's to basically let us say that he has all the power to control things, not only in their matter, but also in their function, also in their position. Therefore, if the Lord Almighty knows everything in that detailed about matter, then you as a human being are not separate from all of these things, whether land, sea, moving, falling, or flying, or whatever it is, or whether it's hiding in, or maybe even buried in deep in the land, or whatever it is. إِلَّا فِي كِتَابٍ مُبِينٍ. There's no running away. There's no hiding. Everything is basically going to be under Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's scrutiny, under Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's power. Same thing if you were to talk about, if we're talking about human beings, whether on land, whether on sea, whether coming and falling, or probably taking a certain function, or whether we're speaking about a seed, or whether we're speaking about a human being basically being the darknesses of grave, or whether the person was ratab, meaning the person's body was still moist, or whether their body was basically hardened and skeleton, and everything is basically fi kitabin mubin. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is letting us see these patterns, that you as a human being, whether you were in function, in motion, or whether you were idle, whether you were in ground, or whether you were on land, or whether you were on sea, or whether you were basically alive and moist, or whether you were hard and skeleton, that it's basically just to let us see if that's the case when everything is going to be under the scrutiny, under the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in terms of different matters that you would see, whether it's a seed, or whether it's all these different creations on land or sea, or whether it's a leaf falling. Well, if a leaf is under the vision and the supervision of Allah Almighty, why would you be an exception? And why did it say وَمَا تَسْقُطُ and not perhaps maybe وَمَا يَطِيرُ مِنْ طَائِرٍ, not even when a bird would fly? Why did it say, a waraqa, a leaf falling, and not say maybe a bird flying? You know what I'm saying? Why did it say and talk about a leaf falling and not a bird flying? Why go down and why not talk about going up? Okay. And this is important to keep in mind. It's to let us know that even if a leaf falls, it falls that. And even if you as a human being might fall, you're under the supervision, under the care of your Lord Almighty. So don't necessarily forget that when you go through a fall, that's basically something that is outside of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's power. But gravity and also the things that are up are basically under the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's to let us know that deep in the earth or up in the space or whatever it is all encompassed by the Lord Almighty, and therefore عنده مفاتيح الغيب. The Lord Almighty, when you fall, when things go wrong, whether on land or sea or whatever it is, or whether your rizq basically was hidden in the different things in earth, or things just didn't go right, just remember, the Lord Almighty is the one that you would turn to. Why did he even say that? Why? Because when you look at the ayah before it, remember when it was saying right there, قُلْ إِنِّي نُهِيتُ أَنْ أَعْبُدَ الَّذِينَ تَدْعُونَ? That's in order to remind them that you worship other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The one that really is worthy of worship is really the one that has mafatih al-ghayb. So if the one that has the keys to control all the different elements, whether in knowing how they function or whatever it is, then you should be turning to Allah Almighty and not turning to something else. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is letting the believer basically get this information and get this empowerment as well. And that's why it continues to say, وَهُوَ الَّذِي يَتَوَفَّاكُمْ بِاللَّيْلِ. He's the one that puts you to sleep or to death. Wait a minute. When you look at the word يَتَوَفَّاكُمْ, يَتَوَفَّى actually means to put somebody to death. To put somebody to death. So if it says يَتَوَفَّاكُمْ بِاللَّيْلِ, so throughout the night we would be dead? Does that mean like when we're sleeping we're dead? And how do we understand the context of it? Well, that's why if you were to look at the ayah before it, it basically wanted us to see the things when they are idle or things when they are in movement. Same thing for you. He's the one that puts you in an idle state that is very similar to death. And when you may jarahtum bin nahar, when il-jaraha is to create a wound. Jaraha is to create a scar, to create a wound, to cut something. And jaraha could also mean to do some kind of a motion, movement thing. What is that supposed to tell us? يَعْلَمُ مَا جَرَحْتُمْ بِالنَّهَارِ. And he knows what you had done, what you had wounded, what positions you had taken, what action you had basically done or committed or whatever you had basically done throughout the day. ثم يبعثكم فيه ليقضى أجل مسمى. Then the Lord Almighty would resurrect you in it. ليقضى أجل مسمى, in order for him to basically determine a certain judgment, a certain accountability, and that is أجل مسمى. It's on an appointment day. ثم إليه مرجعكم, then your return is to him, and then he would inform you of what you were doing. What did the ayah want to take us into recognizing? That he is al-Qahiru fawqa ibadah, that he is basically the supreme power beyond his servants. وَيُرْسِلُ عَلَيْكُمْ حَفَظًا, and he would send حَفَظًا. What's a حَفَظًا? Al-Hafadha is supposed to be a preserver, but these preservers are right now coming to preserve something else. حَتَّى إِذَا جَاءَ أَحَدَكُمُ الْمَوْتُ تَوَفَّتْهُ رُسُلُنَا. These preservers are coming in for a different mission. These preservers are actually there to preserve your soul that is destined to death, and they would not give up on it. In other words, they would not let go. And then ثُمَّ رُدُّوا إِلَى اللَّهِ مَوْلَاهُمُ الْحَقِّ, then they would basically return to their Lord Almighty, and the word is مَوْلَاهُمُ الْحَقِّ, and he is their Mawla. He is their authority. That is the true authority. أَلَا لَهُ الْحُكْمُ وَهُوَ أَسْرَعُ الْحَاسِبِينَ. Verily, isn't he the one that basically has judgment? And he is the fastest in holding people accountable. قُلْ مَن يُنَجِّيكُمْ, tell them, who would be the one to protect you, to save you, to give you basically the safety from, there goes that same thing, from the darknesses, whether on land or on sea. You would invoke him. تضرعا. What is it, tadarru'? You would invoke him with complete humility, or with complete silence, or probably rushing to make that dua, and they would say, if Allah saves us from this, we would be thankful. Tell them, your Lord Almighty is the one that would save you from this and from every single calamity, yet you would be dissociating partners with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Tell them, he is the one that is capable of sending, or at least resurrecting and bringing forth some torment from up above you, underneath your legs, or even cover you in disunity and make one of you basically يُذِيقَ بَعْضَكُمْ بَأْسَ بَعْض, and basically let one of you taste the evil of one another. انظر كيف نصرف الآيات لعلهم يفقهون. Let them see how those ayat are clarified, possibly and perhaps that they would be capable of understanding everything. What are we trying to get to here? I want you to see how these ayat are taking us into, number one, letting us see the different dimensions. البر والبحر is mentioned again. البر والبحر, الظلمات was emphasized in a number of those different ayat. الظلمات, the darknesses, and then تدعونه, that's in order to remind them that they were basically worshiping or invoking other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this ayah would basically remind them of that. And then would remind them that, well, if you recognize, that's the key thing, you recognize that within all these different dimensions, whether we're speaking about, let's look at those dimensions. Number one, we're speaking about a dimension, where was it? Right there, ظُلُمَاتِ الْبَرِّ وَالْبَحْرِ, or whether it was talking about min fawqikum, here's that area right from above you, right from underneath your legs, all these different areas, or whether we're speaking about on land, on sea, and whether it's in motion, whether it's idle, all of these different areas is to let us know one key statement. The most important key statement is basically this one. وَهُوَ الْقَاهِرُ فَوْقَ عِبَادِهِ. For he is al-Qahir. What does al-Qahir mean? Al-Qahir, the root is qa-ha-ra. Qa-ha-ra means to have supreme authority over someone, but the other person basically has zero power. That's al-Qahr. Al-Qahr is when one has supreme authority and the other one has zero power, whether in defense or whether in objection or whether in an attack or in any way. They have zero power. That's al-Qahr. Al-Qahr is when the person is feeling that they are powerless. Al-Qahr is when a person feels powerless. When he is al-Qahir, he has the full power. Okay? The person maqhur, the person is basically powerless. The person that is al-Qahir is basically the person that is in basically full power. Okay? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala being al-Qahir for a human being, if we were to call a person Qahir, it usually carries an evil connotation. Okay? If we're talking about human beings, it carries within it an evil connotation. Because al-Qahir would basically carry within it that you are overcoming a helpless being. You are somehow, I guess, you're somehow with that person that is helpless, you're basically abusing them. But just as certain words, when they are described to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that it would basically give honor, but if they were to be described for a servant, that would be considered as a dishonor. Like what? Just like the word al-Qahir, just like al-Kabir. Al-Kabir, if you were to describe a person, a human being, as al-Kabir or al-Mutakabbir, that's definitely carrying a very bad connotation because you're just calling that person arrogant. That's a really bad thing. But the Lord Almighty, because he has the power, he would basically be the one to have only وَلِلَّهِ الْأَسْمَاءُ الْحُسْنَى. The Lord Almighty, the way we would interpret his names, it would only carry a good connotation. A good connotation. Therefore, when we say وَهُوَ الْقَاهِرُ فَوْقَ عِبَادِهِ, at all, it does not mean an evil connotation, but it is to basically reflect a supreme power. A supreme power that the Lord Almighty has, and the word is fawqa. Notice right now we went, in a number of different prepositions, we went into in, up, and down, and fawqa, and here's that word fawqa, up above, and indahu, you could see right there. And of course, those ones were min dunillah. You could see if they're worshiping something that is inferior and less than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is fawqa ibadah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is beyond his servants. That's in order to bring about the contrast. The Quran is always making these contrasts very clear. نفصل الآيات. Okay, it's telling you that their path is wrong, but it doesn't just leave it at that. It tells you, okay, well, here's how this path is right, and here are the elements for it. So when it said وهو القاهر فوق عباده, over his servants, is this carrying within it the inference that this is a threat? Certainly it does. It certainly does. And that's why it said يرسل عليكم حفظا. But he didn't say ملائكة, he just said حفظا. Is that supposed to be a good connotation or what? What is the connotation that it carries within حفظ? He didn't say, even though it really means the same thing. If you were to say يرسل عليكم ملائكة إذا جاء أحدكم الموت, they would basically put you to death and basically just take your soul away and you're dead and you're done. Okay, but that's not what he said. He said he would send certain حفظ. With the word حفظ basically means preservers. What does that mean? So yes, he is al-Qahir, but he also has, remember that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was also beginning with this one, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala كتب ربكم على نفسه الرحمة, that he had determined and that he had ordained that he would be merciful. And even when he would send these angels, certainly they're hafadha to mean preservers, certainly hafadha to mean basically having a certain duty that they cannot let go. This could be one meaning, because when you say hafadha, to not let go, yarhamkumullah, that would basically come with la yufarritun to support that interpretation. Because it said حفظ لا يفرطون, meaning they'll not let go. So if we were to say حفظ is to give the meaning that they would not let go, yeah, we would definitely, that has a supporting word at least for it. If you say حفظ to basically mean preservers, that would also have within context to tell us that, you know, you can choose to be a person that would basically be privileged to get, even during death, to get the angels to come in to preserve your soul gently, okay? And even though they would not let go during that moment, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would basically, you can choose to be privileged that even during death, that it would be an easy death, a death that the Lord Almighty would oversee, that they are coming with the concept of mercy, even when لا يفرطون, even though they would not let go. But when you look at the ayat and the context, you would say that this is more of a threat. This is more of a threat than actually bringing glad tidings. Because when you say al-Qahir, that definitely comes in with that load, carrying supreme power in the face of abd, of a slave that basically has no power whatsoever. And they would then be determined on what path and where they would be destined to. They would then be returned. Can they stop that return? Can they decide and say, no, I don't want to be included in this? There's no way that you can run out and say, I don't want to be included in this, or decide that, you know what, I didn't ask for this. I'm just gonna somehow, you know, pretend I didn't see any of this. I don't want to be part of this. Get me out. There's no way. Ruddu. Notice that word ruddu is basically coming in with the same type of verb, nuhitu. So here we basically have free will. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can order us to basically to not worship other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us free will to apply, not to apply. But then there's also one that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, remember, there is التشريع, and there's also الكوني. We talked about that, الإرادة التشريعية and الإرادة الكونية. We talked about that before. Just because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that, well, He had given you free will, that doesn't mean that He's accepting what you are willing. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَا يَرْضَى لِعِبَادِهِ الْكُفْرِ. There are two types of wills. There's the will that is كونية, natural will, that He had given you, free will. But there's an irada tashri'iyya, there's the legislating will. The Lord Almighty does not accept and never willed that you basically oppose the rulings and the orders of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So now that the person, if that person did not succumb their will to the principles of the Lord Almighty, then there is another will that will one day be qahir, be the supreme power. They would never have the power to reject, have the power to run away from, have the power to oppose, or in any way, because ruddu ilallah, they would be returned to their Lord Almighty. Mawlahum al-haq. Why talk about Mawlahum al-haq in this context? Because il-Mawla is the one to make the decision. Il-Mawla is to basically letting us know that He would be yaqdi al-haq or yaqussu al-haq. He would be the one to inform you of truth, or He would be the one to basically rule in truth, and you would not necessarily have the power to go outside of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had determined and what He had ordained as truth. So therefore, أَلَا لَهُ الْحُكْمُ. Everything goes back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's rule. He's the one that determines what truth is, and certainly He's the one that determines where and how and what destiny we're basically going to be going back to. Okay, so this is it for today. There's a lot of information. We still didn't do everything in Tafsir al-Qurtubi. I know that piece of it, but hopefully, inshallah, we'll get into some of the different things that al-Qurtubi had basically talked about in terms of different words here and there. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to listen, and or even comments, I'd be happy to hear it. I know today was really loaded. Okay, I know today was really loaded, so much to say and so much to look into. This word means that, and all of that is basically part of tadabbur. So take the time to be patient and trying to see how all of this is unfolding, and trying to get another lens, just like we were talking about those prepositions, just going deep inside and then on the surface, and then we're going out and then we're going in, all of that. Take the time to see beyond the words and trying to go deep into the words, and what messages are these ayats sending to us? How is it talking to us? Probably a person, think of it as this way. When a person becomes Muslim, most of the times they will tell you, I read the Quran and it touched my heart and I basically embraced it. But now, you had been Muslim for, I would assume, a very long time, or long enough. Now you're supposed to have graduated that initial part of reading, a surfaced reading for the Quran. Now you're trying to go deeper into the meaning. And certainly, this is kind of, think of it as, trying to go into, I guess, a bachelor's degree, but, a further degree, and maybe possibly a graduate degree, in trying to go deeper and deeper. But in Quran, you'll never feel that you had basically finished all the ideas and scrutinizing the words and trying to understand how coherent the messages that are sent within these ayat. Even if you might actually see one tafsir, I'll go into tafsir A, B, C, D, and all these different tafsir, and each one basically had, I don't want to say a different reading, but I'll say a different interpretation that the other one had probably not seen. And that's what we try to do. We try to see some of those inspirations to go deep and deep inside the ayat and go beyond the surface. That's it, inshallah. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نستغفرك ونتوب إليك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت